The tourism boom is mainly thanks to the rising middle class in China. And according to a report by Alliance, the nation's households saw their financial assets increase nearly 18% last year. But in that same time, their debt also rose by as much as 23%. For more on these trends now, I'm joined by Robert Hockett, live from New York. He's Edward Cornell Professor of Law at Cornell University. Welcome to the broadcast, Professor. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
The rising household debt and consequently liquidity constraints are of real concern right now. Has the household debt problem become this hidden danger to the economic health of China?
It appears to be poised to become a problem. There are a couple things to look out for. The first is the ratio of private debt, and in particular household debt to GDP. The second thing to look at is the growth rate, to see if household debt is growing more rapidly than GDP. If both of those factors are present, then there's definitely something to be concerned about. It's not to say that we're there yet, that there's actually an imminent crisis. It's just to say that the macroprudential finance regulatory authorities will probably want to keep a close eye on where those numbers are going.
Well, let's talk about mortgages and the rise of the middle class in China. Mortgages reached 21.8 trillion yuan. That's $3.2 trillion by the end of April. And it was accounting for nearly 20% of all total loans. Do you think that obviously this is what's part of driving the debt?
That's definitely got to be a part of it, but it's not a problem in itself, right? I mean, it's quite typical for a middle-class society to see mortgage debt constituting by far the greater part of private and in particular household debt. The real question is whether that debt is sustainable, right, and whether it's growing too rapidly. What's also, of course, of concern is whether it's driving essentially a kind of inflation or hyperinflation in the housing markets. Typically, if excess availability of credit is driving home or housing prices up very rapidly, that's typically a sign that what you have is a kind of hyperinflation underway, essentially a bubble. When that kind of thing happens, of course, we all know what happens at the end, right? Once you reach the inflection point, the homes can plummet in value, and then people end up owing more than they own.
The Chinese middle-class consumers, they're expected to be making between $16,000 and $34,000 by the year 2020 and really taking on the world. What are they spending their money on? And are they spending their money on high-end products?
It's interesting. The Chinese middle class looks remarkably like the American middle class does, at least at certain times in our history, and actually more like the American middle class than like, say, the Japanese or the South Korean or the Singaporean middle class. A lot of the financial assets that are held by the Chinese middle class now are in the form of real estate or in stock equities that are available on the stock markets. Those, of course, are the two financial asset markets that are most prone to bubble-like behavior. And of course, when you end up having bubbles that go bust in both of those markets more or less simultaneously or back to back, that's when you have a real serious debt deflation, i.e. depression problem afterwards. That's, of course, what Japan has been facing for about 20 years. That's what we ourselves are to some extent still facing here in the States.
Yeah, and that leads me into the next question I was going to ask you. At the end of last year, the household debt to GDP ratio for China hit 44% roughly. It's not as high as the Japanese level, which was around 60%. The U.S. is around 80%, UK 87%. Right. But still, you have real concern.
I have concern about the future. So 40% is actually at the very low end. Well, I shouldn't say the very low end, but is rather low at the moment. You don't really have to worry in a serious way until you reach about 125 or 150% on the one hand, and then again, a rapid growth rate in that debt level at the same time. So China clearly isn't there yet, but I think it's best to sort of be on the lookout for these problems before they become truly problematic. I've got a lot of confidence in the People's Bank of China. The Chinese central bank seems to be very good at tracing the right indicators. I suspect that they'll know when to move. But I do hope that my belief is correct, right? Again, it would be premature to act now, but it's something to keep an eye on because it won't be that long before China gets there on current trend.
Well, some economists are saying that the year 2020 could be the pre-crisis peak when you compare it to what the U.S. went through. What can be done between now and then to turn this around?
Well, it doesn't have to be turned around yet, I think, as much as very carefully watched. But when the time comes to turn it around, or maybe better put, when the time comes to slow down the rate of the growth, The key point is for the macroprudential authorities, in particular, that would be the People's Bank of China in your case, the key thing to do would be to place limits on how much leverage people can take out in order to purchase either speculative stock or related assets on the stock markets or real estate. So the way to do that, of course, is to sort of lay down lower loan-to-value ratios. Say that you have to, say, put 20% down before you can buy a piece of real estate, maybe 15% if 20 seems extreme. Leverage limits of that kind, on the one hand, can help slow down the rate of credit growth and hence can slow down the rate of debt growth. And at the same time, they'll want to keep an eye on interest rates, although that's a less potent tool. But it's nevertheless something to watch because real estate is thought to be particularly sensitive to interest rates.
Professor Robert Hockett, we're going to have to leave it there from Cornell University. Thank you. Joining us live from New York.